Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jens Hoffmann. I'm the editor of the Exhibitionist, the magazine that we are going to talk about today. And the Exhibitionist is a magazine I started with Chiara Figone about a year and a half ago. It comes out twice a year, and it's focusing on exhibition making and subjects around curatorial practice. It's actually the first magazine that dedicates itself completely to investigations of curatorial practice. We have so far published 4 issues that you see there. And as you notice, our design, but specifically the cover design, has been quite inspired by the legendary magazine Cahiers du Cinéma. The reasons for that was that I was always interested in the theory of film, and particularly the author theory that was launched by François Truffaut, a French filmmaker, who wrote a very influential text in Cahiers du Cinéma. And what was one of the hallmarks of Cahiers du Cinéma was really the quality of the writing and the particular type of contributors that they had. Almost every major French director from the Nouvelle Vague at one point or the other, whether it was Jacques Rivette or Jean-Luc Godard and Louis Malle, they all were at some point the editors of Cahiers du Cinéma. So I was hoping that I could create something similar to Cahiers du Cinéma in the field of curating, a magazine that would be written entirely by curators for curators. And the yellow issues are the first 3 issues, and the 4th one that just comes out, today is the launch of the 4th issue, is a special issue that we called La Critique. And every 4th issue from now on will be an issue where we reflect upon the first 3 issues, or the previous 3 issues. So number 4 is looking into some of the themes and subjects that we have discussed in the previous 3 issues. So we looked at the previous 3 issues and came up with 4 different themes that were very relevant to this discussion over the last year in our magazine. And those are the 4 issues that I would actually like to discuss this afternoon with Hans-Ulrich Obrist. Hans-Ulrich Obrist is also on our editorial board. And I've known Hans-Ulrich Obrist for probably about 10, 12 years, maybe also maybe a little longer, and we have had a close working relationship, friendship. So in a way, the Exhibitionist is also the result of many of the conversations that I've had with my colleague. And that was the reason why I asked Hans-Ulrich if he would join me here to launch this new issue and to be my conversation partner. And I wanted to look at these issues that we have selected here for the 4th issue, and maybe get a little bit on your point of view on these. So one of the points that came up quite a lot in the previous issues was the discussion around the relationship between the artist and the curator. And since curatorial practice has gained so much momentum, there's always been the critique of artists, almost all the way going back to the 70s, when Daniel Buren wrote his very influential essay, Exhibition of an Exhibition, in the Catalogue of Documenta 5, where he was criticizing the central position that Harald Seemann was holding within the formation of that particular Documenta edition. As a curator that works very closely with artists on the one hand, but also is very prominent now in the art scene. What is your point of view in regards to the relationship between artists and curators? Do you think there's a hierarchy, or maybe you could talk a little bit about it and describe it from your particular point of view?
Yeah, I'm just discovering the new issue, and many congratulations. It's obviously very exciting. It's almost a meta issue, right? It's the issue on all the previous issues. And I mean, I've been fascinated by this magazine from the very outset, because indeed there is very much, a lack of literature. There is in general a lack of exhibition literature, and it seems quite extraordinary given the fact that there are all these curatorial schools now and the number of people in the field. And I mean, we had a research done a couple of months ago, about the use of the word curating, and it has really exponentially grown over the last couple of years. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. I mean, when I started to to sort of use that term and started to work as a curator in the early 90s, most people thought it was a medical profession. You know, it was just not. It was not kind of a profession which somehow was well known, and in some kind of way, what has happened is, I think, hugely interesting, because the variety of contexts, the proliferation where it's used is extraordinary, and it's used more and more on websites, blogs are being curated, even conferences are now more and more being curated. I mean, Anderson, who curates TED, you know, calls himself the curator of TED. And obviously, it's a notion which, I mean, Dorothea von Hantelmann, who writes here, I think has written one of the most substantial texts, and I mean, this is just a short text here about many more things she has written, why in our time the notion of curating in society becomes more important. However, I suppose that doesn't really change anything, you know, in the relation artist-curator. I've always believed in a very artist-centric, you know, art world, because I think there wouldn't be an art world without artists, and I think all, you know, great curators I have met have always been extremely close to artists, and have had extremely close dialogue with artists, and certainly not been in a tension with artists or in a competition with artists. On the contrary, it's really the opposite, I would say, of a competition. It's a kind of an extremely close dialogue, and that's, one can see that with Samperg, one can see that with Alexander Dorner, one can see that throughout the 20th century with Pontus Hultén. They were really friends with artists. Now, obviously, in your chapter, The Artist and the Curator, one of the things which I thought was very interesting, and we talked about it before over coffee, is the idea that artists are very often also curators. And the thing, I mean, if one looks at exhibition history, which is obviously the other thing which is missing, I mean, not only was it very necessary that there is a magazine which you did, which is about exhibitions, but also is there a lot of missing history? You know, I mean, it's kind of astonishing to which extent there are still so many books missing about exhibition history. The writings, as most kind of key writings, are just not in print. And if you think about this idea that we go really through the sort of most important exhibitions of the 20th century and 21st century, and Bruce Altschuler has done this in a very admirable way with his Freiden book, and I think he's planning now a second volume, which is soon going to come out, but in his sort of first volume, it really shows exhibition history, and one sees to which extent actually very often artists have curated the most relevant exhibitions. I mean, if it's Duchamp's Surrealist shows, or if it's the Dada Fair, the Dada Messe, you know, these have all been artist-driven exhibitions. In my experience, in our time, I mean, particularly in my generation, for example, if it's Liam Gillick or Philippe Pareno or Ricky Tiravanija, have all made major, you know, contributions. Dominique Gonzalez-Förster, major contributions to, you know, curating, and I think it's interesting to talk about this. If we talk about the artist and the curator, the idea of the artist as a curator, for me it's as important that very often I've actually decided to co-curate shows with artists. No, like when we did Utopia Station, we co-curated it with Rick Ritt and Molly Nesbitt, or when I would do the Zone show, I would co-curate it with Carrie Swin Evans, another incredible curatorial mind, you know, among artists. So when we do Tempo del Postino, I would curate it with Philippe Pareno. And as much as this is present in your magazine, you also made a decision to only have curators write, and I thought it would be interesting to talk about this.
Yeah. Well, I think, as I said to Hans Ulrich, that I think if artists start curating, then they're artists who curate rather than becoming curators, because the main focus of their activities in most cases is still making art rather than making exhibitions. But of course, there are also those artists who have picked up on exhibition making almost as their own medium, and there have been, I think, also a few curators who sort of moved more and more into the sphere of like understanding their exhibitions, if not as an artwork, but definitely as a sort of result of a creative process. And I think that curating today would probably not be what it is if it wouldn't have been for the influence of artists. I'm particularly thinking about the whole notion of institutional critique and how that has had a dramatic influence on the development of curating, particularly in Western Europe and in North America. The idea that the artist would investigate and to a certain degree criticize the institution, the interpretation of art, and the production of art has been something that artists have developed and curators in some ways appropriated. And I guess that the Exhibitionist in itself is somehow also the result of that, a sort of form of self-reflexivity where we are investigating what we are actually doing as curators. And it was very important for me to say, okay, this is a magazine where I would like to invite the leading voices of the curatorial debate today to reflect upon their profession. I mean, a large part of the magazine, for example, is dedicated to what Ulrich was already saying, the history of exhibitions. In each issue, we invite one curator to write about an exhibition that took place in the 60s, 70s, or even in the 50s, and write an essay about, a show that maybe is not on everybody's mind. I mean, having taught in many curatorial courses, there's like a handful of exhibitions that are always discussed in the seminars around the history of exhibitions. So we wanted to broaden this, we wanted to open this up and throw in some other exhibitions that might be interesting for the students to get to know.
Yeah, which is here that the response too, really, towards a history of exhibitions, right? And I mean, the thing
the history of exhibitions now really becomes a field of investigations, really on an academic level.
And it is still, as you say, I mean, completely limited very often to the study of very often always the same show. I mean, there has been so much has been written about when attitudes become form, but there are so many other shows of the 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s which are, deserve to be rediscovered. And I mean, Dan Graham says something very important in relation to exhibition history. Dan Graham says, we very often look at the past, but we don't really look at the just past, and that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And very often there is an amnesia about the just past. And I mean, one of the things which I also think is interesting about, the Exhibitionist is that you don't just look at shows of the 60s, but that actually very often you look at shows of 5 or 10 or 15 years ago, where maybe the amnesia degree is actually the biggest, because it's not yet a subject of, scholarly research, yet it's somehow, over and not documented. I mean, the thing about exhibition, we must maybe also address a little bit more why there is amnesia and why there is a necessity, to protest against forgetting. And it obviously has to do a lot with the fact that exhibitions are not being collected. And that's, anyway, I mean, one of the things, if one looks at the Exhibitionist, one can really wonder why, no? And it's something, I mean, Daniel Buren raised this issue a lot in an interview we made a couple of years ago. He said, after a century of the exhibition becoming the medium of art and so many artists using the exhibition as a medium, it's so strange that still exhibitions are not being, collected. And Buren made this very interesting, experiment that at a certain moment he collaborated, with a collector who actually, they made a contract and the collector could only buy works by Daniel Buren and by no one else for an entire year. So, December arrived and the collector could again collect other things. And Daniel told me the first thing the collector did, flew to Berlin and bought an entire exhibition of Lawrence Wiener. So, this idea that it is actually possible to collect exhibitions, and that's an example of a private collector, but you can obviously also think, public institutions can collect exhibitions, and that's very interesting because then you can revisit. And I mean, a good example is at the moment in Munich, which is the, Theatergarten Bestiarium, which is one of the key exhibitions really, of artists addressing also notions of garden and, relating to Dan Graham. But there is many artists were in this group show, and there was Guy Tortosa and Chris Sterken, and of course Rüdiger Schöttle, very much involved with this project. And actually the exhibition went into some FRAC in France. That means the FRAC, the regional art center, just bought the show. And that means that now, 20 years later, or I don't know how many years, but, more or less 2 decades later, the museum, can basically just show this exhibition. It's like a time capsule. And that's kind of interesting. I mean, that happened also when we did Tempo del Postino here in Basel with Philippe Pareno, our opera, which happened 2 years ago. It happened 2 years earlier in Manchester. And with an opera, that happens all the time. And you basically do an opera and then you restage it. It just goes into a container. And then 2 or 3 years, you restage it again. So I think the amnesia has a lot to do with the fact that very often exhibitions are just not, kept together, and then they are dissolved. Very often that's also might be difficult if all exhibitions become permanent, but still there is a very big necessity to protest against forgetting. But maybe it would be interesting. I mean, Dan Graham's example of the just past. Can you maybe give some examples of more recent shows you revisited in the exhibition history?
Well, yeah, I like this idea of the just past, and now being in my late 30s, I've actually seen many of those shows, but some of them that maybe you've seen at the beginning of your career, you started working as a curator very early on were exhibitions that I didn't have the privilege to see, and but somehow they felt really influential in terms of how we talk about curatorial practice today. So those are exhibitions that we are trying to investigate in our magazine as well. I think Chambre des Amis, for example, was an exhibition that we were looking at, and Sonsbeck in '93 was another exhibition that we are discussing to look back to. So now I think little by little there's really a field of exhibition history being established with many books that I know about that are being written at the moment, and we actually have one contribution in the current issue by Christian Rattemeyer that is titled "What History of Exhibitions," where he really talks about like how can a canon of exhibitions be formed, and how would that be done, and what exhibitions should enter that canon. And it's a quite interesting contribution in regards to really bringing up a canon and building a history there. One of the things that I often receive as a critique, not only for making this magazine, but also being involved in the conversation around curating, is that now, the curating seems to move away further and further from actually its relationship to art, because we don't really talk about art primarily. What we do is we often talk about arts, but looking at the history of exhibitions. How would you respond to that critique, that there's too much focus on issues of curatorial practice? Yeah, that sort of like brings us maybe to the curatorial education part.
Yeah, it brings us to the third chapter, really. And I mean, the thing is, obviously the whole phenomenon of curatorial school is a very recent one. And I mean, when I started in the sort of late 80s, there were very few curatorial schools around. I mean, Grenoble was an early one, and obviously had, a very, very strong presence of that school. And then the Apple was very early. There were a couple of schools were there then, but there were, 4 or 5, not more, in the world. And it's kind of interesting that most curators still then learned all the things on the job somehow. And I think, from artists and doing exhibitions and from, working with curators concretely on shows. And I think obviously, there's nothing wrong, on the contrary, that now there is this polyphony of curatorial schools, and, it's a positive thing that it exists, and some are better than others, and some are great. And nevertheless, there is one thing which I think is important about this, which is that the proximity to artists and the proximity to art, doesn't disappear. And I think particularly, if curators all the time talk to curators, it can be quite an incestuous situation, no? Because it sort of becomes curating, meta-curating of some sort. And I think for this very reason, I think it's very important that we don't isolate curating. A curator is a generalist of some sort, I believe. And I think it's very problematic if curating becomes an isolated discipline. I think it's important that somehow it's embedded, and that's why I think it's interesting. A curatorial school, there's no reason why it wouldn't be embedded in an architecture school, in an art school, even in a university. It should not be isolated from knowledge. It should be embedded, and the students should have access to all kinds of other fields of knowledge. And I think one thing which is also important is obviously, if you look at the Exhibitionist, which does in an admirable way really cover art curating and produces memory for art curating, that could be an entire other magazine about architecture curating, no? Mm-hmm. Because there is an incredible field of architecture curating. There could be an entire other magazine about science curating. So in some kind of way, curating today is not only curating of art, and you always have people from other fields, who enter in a very unexpected way. So for example, for me and for lots of artists also of my generation, probably the most important show was Les Immatériaux. Now, Les Immatériaux was done by Lyotard, who as a philosopher at some point decided, he would stop a year, to write, and instead of writing a book, he would write an exhibition, which is exactly what Bruno Latour did, a few years ago, when first he joined our laboratorium project and then started on his own to do shows in Karlsruhe with Peter Weibel. And we can say, Latour has really used the medium of the exhibition, but as a philosopher, as a historian of science, and this is also part of curating. And I think it would be very, very, regrettable if, we disconnect curating from all these, connections to other fields, to other disciplines. And for this very reason, I opt very much for sort of curating schools which are, and curatorial education, which is a generalist education. And as part of that, obviously, the whole idea of learning on the job, I think, is really key, because I think at the end of the day, what really matters in terms of a learning process, is to do a show and to work on a show. And I think, we've all started doing exhibitions, and it's by doing this exhibition that we learn. And so I think that's why with curatorial, education, internships, and also working on exhibitions is very important. I mean, the current thing we did in Berlin is one example where basically Klaus Wiesenbach, Christine Marcel, and I advised an exhibition which is curated by 5 very young curators, who are actually the curators, and we are just the advisors. And so that's another form, how transmission can happen, that one actually, has maybe curators who have done a lot of biennales advising or being in an advisory role. I think there are lots of different possibilities of curatorial education by learning on the job, right? I mean, internships are another great way, I think, for young curators to make experiences by really working on a show and also getting to know artists, and working very concretely with artists. But maybe we should hear more from you about this chapter here, about curatorial education, because obviously it's not something which only pops up in the red issue. You have curatorial education already in the first, second, and third issue. That's why it's summarized here. Can you maybe give a summary where it stands?
Well, I think that curatorial education is a very particular topic to talk about, and I think I personally, probably much more like you, we both studied something completely different, or at least not curatorial practice or art history. You studied economy, and I come from a background in theater, and then really learned curating by working on exhibitions with other curators, or began doing our own exhibitions very early on. And the whole field of curatorial education, even though there have been schools around probably like for 15 years now, is still really in an early stage. And I'm very involved with curatorial education, specifically at the California College of the Arts in San Francisco, where I'm working with the students on a number of different seminars and programs. And I guess while the curatorial education was developing and progressing, and curating has changed so dramatically as well. So it's very hard to ever really come to a stop with thinking, okay, now we establish a particular model for curatorial education, because once you start doing that, there's immediately another way of looking at curating. I think when you look at all the curatorial schools, they all are quite different from another. And I think as a student or as a young person who wants to go and study curating, there's a lot of different ways of approaching this. I think that our program at CCA is very different from the program at Bard College, and the Bard College program is again very different from the one at the Apple, and the Apple is very different from the one in Grenoble, and so on. And I don't even know, I think there's probably about 20 different programs around the world right now that offer an education in curating. I don't know if all of them are, if so many are actually necessary, but I remember from my studies in theater that, in the 1910s, there was a debate around whether or not there should be schools for acting. And, Stanislavski, the great Russian director, was always saying that actors should just go on stage and work with the director, and that's the way how they would learn acting. And then they started having acting schools, and people were very critical about this. And maybe at some point it is going to be a completely normal situation that we have curatorial schools and curatorial education. But ultimately, I think they always are very much related to the people who run them, the people that are involved in these programs. And I guess for a young person who aims to have a curatorial education, it's probably very important to do a lot of research about the specific program that they're entering in.
And also grants. I mean, I think what is important. I mean, for me, what really got me started, at the beginning. I mean, obviously, it was a self-organized start because I did my first show in the kitchen. But then immediately after the kitchen, I got 2 grants, And I mean, without those grants, I would never have been able to do what I did later on. I got a grant from the Swiss government. There's a kind of a Eidgenössische grant, in Bern, and they will give you a grant, and then one could sort of work for a few months. And then I got an international grant from the Cartier Foundation, and that's really interesting because at that time, the Cartier Foundation had these, I mean, there were very few curatorial schools, I mean, maybe 3, 4, 5, and as you say now, there are maybe 20 or 30. But there was this grant, and the Cartier Foundation had a residency. It was before they were in Paris. They were on the outskirts of Paris. And they invited, young emerging curators to be there with artists. And that I thought was a very interesting model, because I was a baby curator. I was just like 23. I had started. So for the first time, I could leave Switzerland. I arrived in Paris. And I have great neighbors, Huang Yongping on my left-hand side, the great Chinese artist, Absalon, the late great visionary Israeli sculptor on the other side of the apartment, and we would speak every day. And then some other artists arrived, and it was really an extremely interesting mix. That suddenly as a curator I was thrown in a residency where there were all the artists. I had the role to be the testimony of some sort, and would write about the experience, and otherwise would just make studio visits. After me, Ute Meta-Bauer arrived. 2 months later, Nancy Spector arrived. We were all just starting, And so that was a very interesting model. And I think there are far too few of those residencies around right now, because I think that's something which really should be built upon, to have more support. Grants and residencies for young emerging curators is very important, to just allow, not necessarily immediately to produce. Because I think what is also very dangerous is this idea that one has to instantly produce lots of shows. Because I think the great thing about these grants was that they allowed to do research. They just allowed, in my case, because that was always my research. It doesn't have to be the research of all curators, but in my case, it was making studio visits. And for another curator, it might be another kind of research. But I think more grants, and residencies are really key, because there are many, many more residencies for almost any other profession. There are hardly any, curatorial residencies. And then obviously, the other thing in terms of curatorial education, which is, I think, really interesting, I like a lot the centerfold here in your magazine, which I think is incredibly useful. And Foucault once wrote that he hoped that his writings would be used by others as a toolbox. And I really think that the centerfold here is a great toolbox, I think, hopefully not only for curators, but for all kinds of practitioners in the art world and elsewhere, because this is just simply every single book. If I understand well, it's every single book which has ever been mentioned in your magazine, right in the first 3 issues. And this is really an exhibition literature. It sort of constitutes a field of exhibition literature. And it shows actually that there is quite a lot of literature out there, but it is still very, fragmentary. And there is still a lot of key texts are now translated, a lot of key texts are not accessible. To give you an example, it's still very difficult to find the writings of Alexander Dorner. It's still very difficult to find the writings of Willem Sandberg. And these are absolutely foundation texts, which every student should read. And so there is still a lot of literature missing, but we can see that there is a lot of literature, and this will also make clear then what is missing. Because I think very often what is also great in terms of this rather new field is that we can see what is missing quite clearly. And my take has always been, rather than to complain that it's missing, we just then have to do these books, which are kind of missing. But I thought that was a really great idea.
Yeah, I think being involved with all of this subject quite a lot, I'm actually aware of many other publications that are being currently produced, especially in regards to curatorial education and the history of exhibitions. Just going back to curatorial education for one moment, maybe, one of the things that concern me sometimes when I work with students in curatorial education is, of course, that there is maybe great expectations when people leave schools, that they think they will be hired now by museums, and they actually realize that they pretty much have to start again back at the beginning. Either go and work for someone else as an assistant, or starting to do their own shows in off-site spaces. And I noticed that there is maybe also even some sort of economical incentive in terms of a lot of universities or colleges to start curatorial programs right now, because it becomes this sort of trendy and fashionable discipline. I don't know if you read this. There was an article in the Zeit recently where they were saying that in the 70s the youth wanted to be pop stars. Then in the 80s, they wanted to be movie stars. In the 90s, they wanted to be artists. And now in the 2000s, young people all over the place seem to be wanting to be curators. So there's, of course, also a danger to all of that.
Yeah, indeed. And the danger is obviously this idea to think that there is such a profession, which then, is there in terms of existing jobs. Because I think it's still very much this idea that, every curator invents his or her own job in some kind of way. I've never had in my life a job which existed before I had it. Even my institutional jobs have all, nobody had them before. They were invented, And I think in some kind of way, it's almost like when in language you would develop a neologism. It's that kind of thing, that it's sort of like these are, basically new job profiles and new professions. And very often also, shows would not necessarily happen in contexts where before shows would take place. I mean, when we worked with Austrian Airlines, the Museum in Progress on Alighiero Boiti, I mean, nobody had ever, in this sense, worked with an airline on exhibitions. But that obviously means also that there is a lot of opportunity. There is always this possibility to create, new, but it means it's an activity. It's not something one occupies. And then obviously there are very few existing jobs. No, there are museum jobs, but that's a very limited number of jobs out there. And there are many, many more curatorial students right now than jobs there. But I think at the same time, I mean, I think as long as there is this consciousness, that it is about inventing a profession which is still very recent. I mean, one of the things which I find interesting, I mean, very often, collaborators are also interns or researchers, who work, students who work on my exhibitions, they very often then also find jobs or search jobs which are not necessarily in the art world. And I think that's also very interesting because obviously, I mean, if we look at the fact that now curating plays such a major role in other fields than in the art world, plays such a major role in the internet, that the TED conference is being curated, that means also that all of a sudden there are lots of possibilities. I mean, if you think, Brian Eno always told me that he went to art school. And so lots of people in England went to art school, in the 60s and 70s, and then went into music or went into literature, went into other fields. I mean, as you started with something completely different, I started with something completely different, and we came into the art world. So in a similar way, if there is a generalist curatorial education, and it's not isolating itself, but it's generalist, it might also be, because this is a very exciting moment for curating, that there are lots of very unexpected jobs and lots of unexpected professions, and people go into completely different fields. But it's definitely an active thing.
Yeah. Well, I might be personally quite conservative when I look at my own practice at this point, being very interested in making exhibitions. So there is, for me, sort of like difference between curating and making exhibitions. And one of the final subject that we were discussing in the new issue of the Exhibitionist is what I call the paracuratorial, which is curatorial practice that goes beyond making exhibitions. And Hans Ulrich was sort of mentioning this a little bit with his activities in regards to the project that he did with the Museum in Progress, where they collaborated with artists in exhibiting artworks in unusual spaces. But the paracuratorial also refers to the tendency of curators, quote unquote, curating books, curating conferences, curating all kinds of things that are not necessarily related or aiming to go towards the creation of an exhibition. And that is something that has been becoming more and more evident, where curators make exhibitions without artists, or they work with artists without making an exhibition.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm just browsing through it. It obviously has to do, I suppose, also with the idea of an expanded notion of curating, And I mean, I always believe that curating follows art, and that leads us back to the Daniel Buren-Seemann polemic. I mean, obviously, at some point when art seems, to follow curating, there definitely is a problem. And in this sense, I've always been very conservative. I believe curating follows art, and I don't believe in this idea of, creative curating, where curator makes some proposals or premises which then the artists follow. I have a horror of that, because I think, it sort of instrumentalizes the artist. So I believe in this idea that curating, really curating follows art. And so if we think about curating following art, then I mean, a long time ago, Joseph Beuys talked about the expanded notion of art. And it's kind of interesting that obviously many other practices in the 60s, 70s had to do with the expanded notion of art. I mean, it's true for Alan Carpro. It's true for lots of different, artists, that they expanded massively the notion of art. And so it's no surprise that in the aftermath of that, at some point, that leads to an expanded notion of curating, I would say. And I mean, earlier today, Seth Siegelab was here, and when we did the interview for the Brief of History of Curating with Seth, we discussed this idea that he was very, very early on defining a book as an exhibition. His famous Xerox book, so the printed, basically page, the book was the exhibition was the book. And that obviously is something which, continued until today, and there are lots of other possibilities today within this expanded field. But I think one of the things which I think we need to always be aware of is that when we it's a thing Mario Merz often used. It's a sort of a Vietnamese general quote. I've quoted it a lot. When you expand, you win territory and you risk to lose concentration. So when you win concentration, you risk to lose territory. And so I think curating is very much in that kind of tension right now.
Tension, yeah.
You know, in some kind of way, a lot of territory is being won because all of a sudden curating is all over the place. You know, curating is much more public. There is a public interest for it. There is a much bigger circulation also of literature on curating. However, the danger obviously is that goes hand in hand with the loss of concentration. So for me, for example, it's super, super important, I suppose for you as well, to keep that concentration in terms of a very focused institutional practice, because you know we both work within an institution where we organize exhibitions every month. You in San Francisco, I in London, and that's the concentration, and one sort of spreads out, but one has that sort of very concentrated feel. And I think without that, I would be very worried, you know, that concentration would be lost. And that's something in the 90s I didn't feel was necessary. In the 90s, I sort of think we curate the world, and it was sort of all over the place. But sort of after 2000, I felt it's important to not lose concentration. But maybe it's interesting to hear a little bit more about what the Paracuratorial covers here, because it obviously covers lots of different things. It covers, there are 3 texts. Can you maybe tell a little bit more about what the magazine addresses here in terms of the Paracuratorial? Maybe some concrete examples would be good.
Well, I think we have to come to an end, so I just want to quickly respond to this. The Paracuratorial, basically in our magazine, is a little bit of a critique towards the curatorial practices that move beyond the exhibition. I think the magazine, The Exhibitionist, actually also calls itself a magazine, a journal on exhibition making. So our focus is really walking inside the museum, walking inside this a confined space, and actually that's, I guess, very much the focus is working with art and working with objects. And as you say, this is a moment of concentration on the discipline that I'm involved with and that I'm having conversations with many, many different practitioners. So yeah, I think we have to come to an end now. And I just wanted to thank you and also say that we have plenty of issues here of number 4 in the front. So anyone who wants an issue of The Exhibitionist is invited to grab one here from the front, and thank you very much for your attention.